The night was unseasonably warm for Washington, D.C. in early February, but a chill of a different sort was about to settle over the Capitol. It started, as so many modern political firestorms do, not with a formal announcement or a policy paper, but with the faint glow of a smartphone screen at the dead of night. At 11:44 p.m., from the account of the 47th President of the United States, a video began to quietly circulate on Truth Social, a digital ember that would soon ignite a political inferno. Donald Trump was on one of his characteristic late-night posting sprees, a digital deluge that would eventually number more than 70 items. For his followers, it was a familiar ritual, a stream of consciousness from a leader who never slept, a mix of policy proclamations, personal grievances, and a steady diet of internet memes. Among the barrage of retruths and shares was a 1-minute, 2-second video. It was grainy, poorly produced, and at first glance seemed to be yet another rehashing of the most sacred of Trumpian myths, that the 2020 election had been stolen. The video pushed debunked claims about Dominion voting systems, the frequent bogeyman of election conspiracy theorists. It scrolled through images of Trump as a mighty king, a lion ruling over the political jungle. But it was the final few seconds that held the viper's fang. As the cheerful, almost lullaby-like tones of the tokens "The Lion Sleeps Tonight" filled the audio, the screen flashed with an image so vile, so steeped in the darkest history of American racism, that it would freeze the D.C. elite in their tracks. The faces of Barack and Michelle Obama, the first black family to ever occupy the White House, were digitally superimposed onto the bodies of apes, dancing in a jungle. For 1 second, maybe 2, the image lingered. Then it was over, a small part of a long feed of digital noise. But in that brief flash, the President of the United States had crossed a line drawn in the blood and tears of centuries. The Teflon President, as he was often called, had finally posted something that might just stick. As the sun rose over a frigid Washington, the video was still live on the President's account. In the West Wing, the morning began with a sense of routine. But in the press office and the senior staff bullpen, the first whispers of panic were beginning to surface. The early warning system of politics, aides scrolling through Twitter, now X, and the news wires was flashing red. The story was breaking, and it was breaking bad. By mid-morning, the offices of Democrats were already churning out statements. Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader and a black man who had himself been the target of Trump's racist memes, didn't mince words. He called Trump vile, unhinged, and malignant, a bottom feeder whose actions demanded immediate condemnation from every Republican. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, followed suit, calling the post racist, vile, abhorrent, and describing the Obamas as two great Americans who make Donald Trump look like a small, envious man. Kamala Harris, the former vice president who had lost to Trump, saw the hand of the president himself in the controversy, dismissing any suggestion of error as a transparent cover-up. But the real shockwaves, the ones that would ultimately force the White House's hand, came from across the aisle. In an era of hyper-partisanship, where Republican lawmakers had bent the knee time and time again, a few voices began to break ranks. The most significant came from South Carolina. Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate, a man Trump had once seriously considered as a running mate, took to social media. His post was terse, dripping with a disbelief that bordered on pain. Praying it was fake, because it's the most racist thing I've seen out of this White House. The president should remove it, he wrote. It was a dagger. If Tim Scott, a man who had built his career on a message of unity and had loyally supported Trump, was calling it the most racist thing he'd ever seen, the White House couldn't simply wave it away. Then came another Republican senator, Roger Wicker of Mississippi,
who was even more direct. "This is totally unacceptable. The president should take it down and apologize." Mike Lawler of New York joined the chorus, calling the post wrong and incredibly offensive. Inside the White House, the strategy was initially one of defiance, the usual playbook. From the podium and in statements to the Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt went on the offensive. She dismissed the growing uproar as a performative disease she called fake outrage. This is from an internet meme video depicting President Trump as the king of the jungle and Democrats as characters from The Lion King, she told reporters, her tone dismissive. "Please stop the fake outrage and report on something today that actually matters to the American public." In the West Wing, the press secretary's defense was met with a mix of relief and dread by the staff. Relief that they were punching back, dread that the defense was so flimsy. Comparing the first black president to a monkey and calling it a Lion King reference was not a defense that would hold water outside of the MAGA-friendly echo chamber. The fake outrage talking point was a dud, and they knew it. As the clock ticked past noon, the pressure became a palpable force. The story wasn't just on liberal CNN or MSNBC. It was leading every news outlet, from the BBC to Al Jazeera. The hashtag Trump is a racist was trending globally. And still, the video remained pinned to the president's Truth Social feed, a ticking bomb attached to the most powerful office in the world.
In a bizarre display of tone deafness, Trump himself was asked about the firestorm while speaking with reporters on Air Force One. He seemed almost nonchalant, a man peering over the edge of a cliff and seeing no danger. He claimed he hadn't even seen the offending part of the video. He said he saw the beginning, the part about voter fraud, and passed it along to his staff to post. Nobody knew that was in the end, he mused, suggesting that if his staff had been more diligent, they would have had the sense to take it down. When pressed on whether he would apologize, he flatly refused. "I didn't make a mistake." The disconnect was staggering. On the one hand, his staff was publicly blaming an unnamed staffer for an erroneous post. On the other, the president was admitting he saw the video, handled it, and passed it on to dissemination. The staffer error excuse was a classic Washington dodge, but Trump's own words had just blown a hole in it. If he saw it, even just the start, and gave it to staff, the chain of command and responsibility led directly back to the Resolute desk. For nearly 12 hours, the video stood as an official communication from the President of the United States. It wasn't until late Friday morning, just before the noon hour, that the digital artifact was finally deleted. The White House released a terse statement. A White House staffer erroneously made the post. It has been taken down. There was no apology, no explanation of how a staffer had the autonomy to post a racist video under the president's name in the middle of the night. Just a shrug and a scapegoat. The deletion, however, was not an ending. It was a beginning. For the media, the deletion was an admission of guilt, a rare crack in the facade. For the president's supporters, it was a betrayal, a cave to the woke mob. For the rest of the country, it was a stain. In the days that followed, the story refused to die. The focus shifted from the act itself to the cover-up and the profound cowardice of the explanation. The staffer error defense was lampooned across late-night television. How could one staffer be responsible for posting more than 70 items in a single night? How could that same staffer, making an error, choose a video with such a specific, historically loaded racist trope? The lie was so thin it was transparent. The political fallout was messy. While Tim Scott and others had condemned the post, most of the Republican caucus remained silent, a deafening quiet that spoke volumes. They were caught between their revulsion at the image and their fear of the president's base. Meanwhile, the Democrats, sensing blood in the water, hammered the point home. They tied Trump's action to his long history of racism,
The birtherism that launched his political career, the poisoning the blood rhetoric, the attacks on Haitian immigrants, the mockery of Kamala Harris's racial identity. This wasn't an isolated incident, they argued. It was a pattern. It was who he was. For Barack Obama, the silence was his first and loudest response. For a week, the 44th president said nothing publicly. He was in his post-presidential life, building his library, working on his memoir, and carefully choosing his moments to re-enter the fray. Friends and former aides said he was deeply hurt, not for himself, but for Michelle, and for the millions of Black Americans who saw in that video a century of lynchings, of Jim Crow, of being told they were less than human. But he was also strategic. He knew that if he responded immediately, he would become the story. He would give Trump's team the distraction they needed. So he waited. When he finally broke his silence, it was not in a fiery press conference or a dramatic speech. It was in a quiet 47-minute interview with liberal podcaster Brian Tyler Cohen. He was measured, thoughtful, and devastatingly effective. Barack Obama didn't mention Donald Trump by name. He didn't have to. He spoke instead about the state of the nation, the degradation of public discourse, and the loss of a fundamental human quality in politics: shame. It's important to recognize that the majority of the American people find this behavior deeply troubling, Obama said, his voice calm and resonant. He acknowledged the strategy behind the chaos, the understanding that shock value commands attention. It is true that it gets attention. It is true that it's a distraction, he conceded. But then he pivoted, delivering a eulogy for the very idea of public decency. He spoke of the clown show that had taken over social media and television, a never-ending cycle of outrage designed to numb the senses. And then he landed the killer blow. What is true is that there doesn't seem to be any shame about this among people who used to feel like you had to have some sort of decorum and a sense of propriety and respect for the office. That's lost. Shame has been lost. The phrase hung in the air. It was an indictment not just of a single video, but of an entire era. Obama, the man who had occupied that office with a cool, intellectual grace, was pointing out that the current occupant had stripped the presidency of its dignity. He was painting Trump not as a political opponent, but as a small, shameful figure presiding over a circus. The response to Obama's words was immediate. They were clipped, shared, and turned into memes themselves. They became the definitive framing of the event. In one quiet interview, Obama had reclaimed the moral high ground. He had refused to descend into the mud, instead standing on the bank and pointing out how foul the wrestlers had become.
The contrast between the two men, always stark, was now a canyon. On one side, you had a president who, in a fit of late-night insecurity, shared a video likening his predecessor to an ape. On the other, you had that predecessor, responding with a grace and intellectual heft that made the attack seem not just vile, but pathetically small. Obama had, without raising his voice, confirmed every suspicion about his successor's character. The story, however, had one more ironic twist. The very thing Trump had always envied Obama for, the iconic image, would come back to haunt him in a matter of weeks. In late February, the world situation erupted. In coordination with Israel, Trump authorized a major military strike on Iran, an operation named Operation Epic Fury. It was the kind of high-stakes, high-risk military action that defines presidencies. As the bombs fell and the world held its breath, the White House did what every modern administration does. They released a photo of the commander-in-chief monitoring the action. The image showed Donald Trump sitting at a long table in a makeshift command center set up at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida.
He wore a white baseball cap emblazoned with USA in gold letters. He was surrounded by stern-faced advisors, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. The intention was clear: to project strength, control, and presidential gravitas, to show the American people a leader in command during a time of war. But within hours of the White House sharing the photo on X, the Internet did what the Internet does best: it compared. Side by side with Trump's 2026 Mar-a-Lago photo, users placed a famous image from 2011. It was the Situation Room photo, the one of Barack Obama, hunched forward in a cramped chair, surrounded by his national security team, their eyes glued to a screen, watching in real time as Navy SEALs raided a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, to kill Osama bin Laden. The contrast was brutal and immediate. Obama's photo, taken by official White House photographer Pete Souza, is black and white. It's tight, tense, and real. You can feel the anxiety in the room. Obama isn't looking at the camera, he's staring at a screen, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He's in a small, windowless room in the White House, not a resort. He's with his team, not posing for them. Trump's photo, in contrast, is in color, well lit, and looks staged. He sits at the head of a long, polished table, the USA cap a sartorial choice that seemed more suited to a rally than a war room. He looks directly ahead, but it's a pose. The viral post that encapsulated the nation's mood came from Isaiah Martin, a young Democrat running for Congress. This dude has been trying to recreate that Obama photo for a decade now and has failed every time, he wrote. The post garnered millions of views in hours. The comments section became a festival of mockery. Filmmaker Bill Carroll wrote, "He nailed douchebags in a room perfectly, though." A retired news producer quipped, "Forget charisma, he doesn't even smell like Barack Obama." Even a self-described conservative doctor tried to defend Trump by posting a different photo of him pumping his fist, but the damage was done. The comparison wasn't about the success or failure of the military mission. It was about style, substance, and the ephemeral quality of presidential leadership. Trump had spent years trying to tear down Obama's legacy, to erase the memory of the first black president. He had done it through birtherism, through mocking him, and now through racist slurs. But in his desperate attempt to look the part of a wartime president, he had inadvertently invited the very comparison that made him look the most small. Obama in the Situation Room was a man who had just given the order to get bin Laden. Trump, in a makeshift room at his private club wearing a costume hat, was a man playing dress-up. The Iran strikes and the photo comparison brought the February 26 video scandal full circle. It underscored the central irony of Trump's obsession with Obama. Every attempt to humiliate or overshadow his predecessor had backfired, revealing more about his own deep-seated insecurities than anything else. For the historians, the February 2026 video incident will be remembered as a turning point. It was the moment the Teflon finally showed a crack. It was the moment a significant portion of the Republican Party, however briefly, said enough. It was the moment the White House had to admit a mistake, a humiliating act of contrition for a man who prided himself on never apologizing. For the sociologists, it was a case study in the normalization of extremism. The fact that a racist trope, once confined to the darkest corners of the Internet, could be broadcast by the President of the United States, and that his first line of defense was to call it a Lion King meme, showed how far the Overton window had shifted. And for the millions of Americans who watched the drama unfold, it was a source of exhaustion and despair. The constant churn of outrage, the daily degradation of public discourse, the feeling that the guardrails of democracy had been smashed. In a country already deeply polarized, the video was another log on the fire. In the weeks that followed, as the news cycle moved on to the next crisis and the next outrage, the image of the Obamas as apes lingered in the background of the American consciousness. It was a ghost at the feast of democracy, a reminder that the oldest and ugliest hatreds were not just alive, but being given a platform in the highest office in the land. Tim Scott, the man who had called it the most racist thing he'd seen, eventually walked back his criticism, falling in line behind the president once the immediate furor died down. The unnamed staffer who had made the error was never identified. No one was fired. No apology was ever issued. Donald Trump, for his part, continued his late-night posting sprees, a digital monarch ruling over his kingdom of grievances. But for one brief moment in February, the world had seen the man behind the curtain, and even his most loyal subjects had to look away. The attempt to humiliate Barack Obama had not just backfired, it had detonated in the face of the person who launched it, leaving a stain not just on a social media feed, but on the office of the presidency itself. And in the quiet dignity of Obama's response and the cruel mockery of the viral photo comparison, the final verdict was delivered. The 44th president, even in silence, stood taller than the 47th ever could.